Pay attention. What happened in Bradford was not just a night of chaos. It was the clearest sign that the UK is on the brink of a historic rupture, something even the papers lack the courage to admit. And before you blink, I need to show you exactly how the explosion began, who really lit the fuse, and why thousands of Brits, parents, workers, mothers, decided they would no longer stay silent in the face of a government that seems to live in a world completely separate from the people. The audience watching this channel, especially those with more life experience, knows how to recognize when a country loses its grip. And Bradford showed just that. Imagine the scene. 8:47 p.m., no warning, no official statement. Just a red flare tearing through the sky. A flare that didn't just light up that neighborhood. It exposed the massive failure of Starmer's government. In seconds, the entire city's mood shifted, as if every family realized at once that something had broken. This is exactly why half the country no longer trusts this government. Because when the people asked for dialogue, they got silence. When they asked for transparency, they got secret orders. That flare wasn't just light. It was the response of a tired, betrayed, and ignored people. And the most shocking thing is that it didn't even take a minute for the situation to spiral out of control. Hundreds of people from different communities, something extremely rare, advanced together, united not by ideology, but by real outrage. Phones in hand, voices trembling, steps quickening. The first police line simply collapsed like wet paper. And pay attention to this, because here's the point. The government refuses to admit. This wasn't a violent mob from the start. It was a desperate mob, desperate to be heard. But when Starmer's name began echoing through the streets, it was him. This chaos is his. The whole city seemed to wake from months of numbness. And my audience knows all too well that this kind of spontaneous reaction doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a buildup, uncontrolled migration, lack of public consultation, decisions forced down people's throats. All of it exploded at once. And as people ran, mothers pulled children away from breaking glass, shopkeepers shut their doors as if in a lawless country. And what little trust remained dissolved like smoke. Thick, dense smoke rising between houses like a warning. Something much bigger than a protest was being born in Bradford. And as the smoke swallowed the streets, something even more symbolic happened. A second flare exploded in the sky, this time bathing the neighborhood in an aggressive, almost metallic orange, as if the city itself was answering the first call. At that exact moment, according to witnesses, someone shouted the words that turned a tense protest into an inevitable revolt. "This is Starmer's fault. This migration order was dumped on us." And here's the detail my audience understands immediately. Accusations like that don't come from a vacuum. They only gain strength when the government has lost all public trust. From that shout, the whole street seemed to change. Mothers dropped shopping bags, young people started filming, shopkeepers rushed to close their shutters. The UK, once proud of its order and stability, watched in real time as a government lost control of not just the narrative, but reality itself. The feeling? Abandonment. Betrayal. Total impotence from a distant cabinet. Bradford didn't wait for any official statement. Bradford responded in its own way, and no one in Westminster was ready for it. And the intensity only grew. Ask any resident from that night. Everything happened too fast, as if the city had held its breath for weeks and finally let it all out at once. The sound of breaking bottles mixed with shouts, running footsteps, the hollow thud of police shields being struck. The police, clearly unprepared, another chapter in the government's strategic incompetence, tried to set up an improvised containment line. But the crowd didn't come in a straight line. It came in waves, like a living organism, pulsing, driven by a goal no one could ignore any longer. We're the ones paying for London's decisions. And that's the reality my audience understands better than any BBC political commentator. When people realize the government is using their city as a testing ground for failed policies, patience simply runs out. And that night, it ran out for good. The atmosphere, which started with tension, turned to revolt, then outrage, and soon became that dark certainty that spread across the entire UK. If Bradford exploded like this, who would be next? Then came the breaking point, the moment that turned a tense night into a historic marker of government failure. At 9:06 p.m., a single bottle struck a police shield, making a sharp crack that echoed as if the city itself had broken inside. The sound was so loud, so decisive, that even those filming lowered their phones in reflex. The police line wavered. And, my friend, when the line wavers, everything collapses. It was as if Bradford had held its breath, and, in that second, unleashed all the anger built up from Westminster's neglect. In less than 60 seconds, 58 stones flew over the officers' heads, followed by 63 Molotov cocktails, yes, 63, painting the asphalt with fire explosions that tore through the darkness. And here's what my viewers understand immediately. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't bad luck. It was a consequence. A direct consequence of months of Starmer's reckless decisions, made in secret, without dialogue, without planning, and without the slightest respect for the communities that would be affected. Bradford didn't explode out of nowhere. Bradford exploded because it was pushed to the limit, and the government pretends not to understand. The smoke rose so fast that, according to reports, the sky turned grey in minutes. Not the usual British grey, but a thick, suffocating grey, heavy with burnt petrol and social frustration. And as visibility dropped, the crowd only grew. Young people pushed forward, women shouted for their children to go home, and in the middle of it all came the cries that summed up the soul of that night. "Protect Bradford!" And Starmer did this! Notice this detail. The people weren't just angry. They were convinced. Convinced that the Prime Minister had sacrificed Bradford, as if it were disposable, as if it were a cheap social experiment. And that conviction moved the impossible. A rare phenomenon was seen. Groups that normally don't mix. Young people, families, shopkeepers, drivers, all marching in the same rhythm, as if they'd found a common enemy. In minutes, the protest lost its clear direction. It became a giant whirlpool, a human spiral spinning through the streets, dragging barricades, dragging frustrations, dragging everything. And every face in that crowd seemed to say the same thing. The government had crossed the line, and now it would have to deal with the consequences. Then came the scene no Briton imagined seeing in 2025. A police car overturned in City Park, turned into a living symbol of national authority's collapse. It started when a patrol car tried to reverse, desperate to escape the advancing mass of indignation. But the driver, pressured by the chaos, hit a bollard, lost control, and flipped onto its side. In seconds, the crowd rushed, as if they'd found the perfect spark to show their fury at London. The flames started small, then grew, then consumed everything, and that vehicle became the most powerful image of the night. But the most impactful thing wasn't the fire. It was what came after. A man climbed onto the burning car, raised his arms like an ancient warrior, and shouted to the sky, "He did this! Starmer did this to us!" And as if his voice had its own energy, hundreds responded. It was as if Bradford was officially declaring it no longer recognized the authority of a government that made secret decisions, lied, manipulated, and dumped responsibility onto already overburdened communities. That burning car wasn't just a vehicle on fire. It was national trust being reduced to ashes, right there, in front of everyone. But while some shouted, others tried to survive in the midst of the chaos. And this is where the video grips viewers even more, because the scenes that followed showed a city completely divided between fear, fury, and courage. A woman, about 60 years old, fell to the ground, pushed by the crowd trying to escape the smoke, descending like a heavy blanket. She could have been trampled, could have been ignored. But two young people, who didn't even know each other, threw themselves into the crowd to lift her up and shield her with their arms, like a human shield. And that says a lot about Bradford that night, because, despite the chaos, there was humanity. Despite the anger, there was unity. Groups that normally barely glance at each other were there, side by side, facing a collapse that shouldn't have existed, if the government had done its job. But this is exactly where my audience understands the central point of this video. Starmer didn't just fail. He divided communities, ignored advice, stoked tensions, and then feigned surprise when everything blew up. And while the woman was saved by strangers, the rest of the street became a living creature, directionless but with a clear purpose, to show that Bradford would no longer be treated as disposable by protected politicians who live in London as if in another country. Before I go on, let me ask you something important. If you're following this situation and believe the British people deserve the truth that the mainstream media hides, then like this video now and subscribe to the channel. Here, we say what London tries to silence. Your like and subscription are crucial to getting this message to more people who are also tired of this government that has turned its back on the country. And the chaos didn't stop there. It took on a new, almost strategic form, almost impossible to contain. Aerial cameras revealed something that looked choreographed, but was in fact the pure expression of a people pushed to the limit. The crowd formed a giant spiral, a circular movement that absorbed smaller groups and fed them back into the center, creating a constant flow of pressure against any police containment attempt. It was like watching a human hurricane, charged not with wind, but with revolt. And in this whirlwind, shouts began to echo. "We weren't consulted! Bradford isn't a migration crisis dump! Starmer did this in secret!" It was impossible to control, because it wasn't just a crowd. It was a collective feeling, a painful certainty that the government had lied, manipulated, and dumped a national problem onto a city already at breaking point. Meanwhile, in the surrounding streets, shop windows shattered as if keeping time with the revolt. Doors flew off their hinges, and every shard that hit the ground asked the same silent question. If the government fails this badly in a single neighborhood, how will it protect the whole country? And that question, which many in my audience have been asking for months, became impossible to ignore that night. But perhaps the most emblematic scene was when a group raised their phones at the same time, displaying the proof that became pure fuel for this social fire. The image of the leaked document, the so-called migration directive, with Starmer's name stamped at the bottom. It was the visual confirmation needed to turn frustration into fury. Those in the crowd say that the moment the screens lit up with that document, it was like throwing a torch into a petrol depot. "It was him!" dozens shouted at once. "He signed it! He lied!" The revolt found direction, focus, a face. And here's the detail the government pretends not to see. A people can tolerate incompetence, but not betrayal. And that's exactly what Bradford felt that night. Because the outrage didn't arise by chance. It was born when the population discovered They were being used as an improvised solution to a national problem that London was too afraid to face. As the document spread from hand to hand, from screen to screen, the government's official narrative melted like wax in the sun. It was no longer possible to control the damage. It was no longer possible to say it was misinformation, misunderstanding, or exaggerated interpretation. People saw, they read, they shared, and they decided they would no longer stay silent. While Bradford burned on the outside, London burned on the inside. And this became clear the moment the first images of the chaos reached Downing Street. The crisis room turned into a theater of panic. Ministers talking over each other, aides running with phones in hand, screens showing drones capturing the fire. The crowd, the overturned vehicle, all in real time. And at the center of the room, motionless like a cracked statue, was him, Keir Starmer. Jaw clenched, eyes wide, the expression of a man who realized too late that he had lost control not just of a city, but of the entire country. Advisors tried to push improvised solutions. Declare a curfew. Call in reinforcements now. Say you're monitoring closely. But anyone with the slightest experience knew these responses wouldn't come close to stopping the damage. Because the problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the cause of the fire. A secret decision, imposed from above, signed by him without consulting anyone. And when an aide rushed in and said, "Prime Minister, the directive has leaked. It's gone viral. The whole country is seeing it." The silence that filled the room was the kind of silence that brings down governments. It was official. The lie had been exposed. The narrative had slipped from his hands. And now, what was burning wasn't just Bradford. It was the authority of the government itself. And the UK reacted like a body hit by an electric shock. Within minutes, cities with no direct link to Bradford began to move, each feeling the same pulse of revolt that had taken Manningham Lane. In Leeds, hundreds gathered outside Kirkgate Market, clapping, shouting for answers, and accusing London of abandoning the North once again. In Manchester, students marched down Oxford Road holding signs with the leaked document's photo, as if it were evidence of a crime. In Cardiff, rumors, even unconfirmed, were enough to mobilize entire groups, all believing they too would be used as improvised dumping grounds for failed migration policies. It was like watching a domino effect of national instability. One piece fell, and all the others began to wobble. And the papers, the TV networks, the political commentators who loved defending the left? They all trembled, because, for the first time in many years, the UK was seeing ordinary people, workers, parents, students, shopkeepers, directly rejecting the government's authority. And the most worrying thing, especially for those in power, was this. It didn't seem like random revolt. It seemed like the start of a movement not born from ideology, but from exhaustion, frustration, and a deep sense of betrayal. By the way, comment below where you're watching this video from. I want to see how far the voice of the British people is reaching. Manchester? Leeds? Birmingham? London? Or are you watching from somewhere outside the UK? Write it down, because the strength of this channel comes from you, spread across the country. And it's at this point that the story reaches a level no one, absolutely no one, in Westminster wanted to admit publicly. The crisis was no longer just in the streets. It was inside homes, inside families, inside the minds of millions of Britons watching TV and asking, for the first time in decades, if the government still had control of the country. By midnight, the lights of Bradford didn't shine as a city, but as an emergency zone. Sirens echoed like a metallic lament. Closed windows revealed whole families awake, afraid to sleep. Hospitals activated crisis protocols, something normally only done in natural disasters. And in the side alleys, impressive scenes emerged that no newspaper wanted to show. Police giving masks to children, shopkeepers protecting strangers inside their stores, Muslims and Catholics pushing a burning container away from a bakery together. These were sparks of humanity, trying to survive in a country where political leadership had failed miserably. But these small lights weren't enough to hide the bigger truth. The UK had just entered its most dangerous night since the 2011 riots, perhaps even since the 1980s. And all this because a prime minister believed he could make decisions in the shadows, against the people, without consulting anyone. The people responded, and they responded too loudly to be ignored. And now, faced with this scenario that has shocked the world, the question arises that no government spokesperson can answer. But millions of Britons are asking, what happens next? Because Bradford may have been the epicenter, but the tremor has already spread. London watches in fear. Manchester is restless. Leeds wakes with suspicion. Wales is on alert. Scotland is already preparing to react. And meanwhile, Keir Starmer desperately tries to regain credibility, like a captain trying to command a ship that's already on fire on deck and sinking through the hull. The British people, especially this generation that has seen decades of empty promises, that has seen security traded for speeches, that has seen stability sacrificed for ideology, no longer believe in words. They want action. They want respect. They want an end to hidden policy. They want strong, transparent, patriotic leaders who defend the country instead of using it as a political laboratory. And if the government doesn't understand this immediately, what we saw in Bradford may not have been the peak of the crisis, but only the first chapter. The UK is at a historic crossroads. Either it regains control with firmness, or it will continue to fragment until there's nothing left to save.